Consent to change. What do new gamete and embryo storage regulations mean for you? The hashtag for this event is Extend the Limit. And this event has been made possible thanks to the generous support of the Scottish Government. I'm Sarah Norcross, Director of PET, and I will be chairing the event this evening. As many of you will be aware, PET successfully campaigned for the law to be changed to permit women who froze their eggs for non-medical reasons, so-called social egg freezers, who wish to store their eggs for more than 10 years to do so. Our Extend the Limit campaign not only changed that limit from 10 up to a maximum of 55 years, but also brought in a whole raft of other changes in relation to the storage of sperm, eggs, and embryos. Tonight, we've got this fantastic panel for you who will explore and explain what the changes to the storage rules mean. Joanne is Head of Policy at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the HFEA.
So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, PET, for asking me to speak to you today about the impact of the new gamete and embryo storage rules. So as you can imagine, I have a lot to cover, and the legislation is complex. So I'm going to try to focus on some of the key differences between the old regime and the new regime and think about what that means in practice. So this evening, I'll take you through a brief background and outline the key changes and important dates that have been introduced by the new legislation. I'll highlight some of the main impacts for patients, for donor conception, research, training, and more widely on clinics, and talk you through the support the HFEA has provided and continues to provide to clinics. I'll then finish up with some key broader points, broader take-home messages on the importance of consent and why it matters now more than ever. So to begin with, let's start with a bit of background. So as many of you will know, prior to the 1st of July 2002, the Act set out a maximum storage limit of 10 years. In 2009, the limit was extended to a maximum of 55 years, but only where a patient was or was likely to become prematurely infertile in the written opinion of a medical practitioner. So as Sarah alluded to, there's been considerable stakeholder pressure for reform, arguing that those rules were too restrictive and negatively impacted on a person's reproductive choices, especially when it came to young women storing their eggs and the impact of that 10-year standard storage limit on their choices and options available to them. It was also criticised for being administratively complex and difficult to implement. So many were therefore pleased with the commitment from government to update these rules to reflect the advances in science, changes in modern society, and individuals' reproductive choices, giving patients more time to make those important decisions about their future. So what happened next? So as you'll know, on the 1st of July 2022, new laws came into force in relation to the storage periods for gametes and embryos. Importantly, these changes to the HFE Act supersedes all previous storage regulations. They also importantly introduced a transitional period during which all material already in storage where consent expires must be brought under the new regime, which began on the 1st of July and will end on the 30th of June 2024. So many of you will know that the new law introduced significant changes which have required considerable change to clinic practice. And with the new laws being introduced on the 1st of July, both the HFEA and clinics have had a short lead-in time to prepare for these changes and the complexities of the new legislation. And that's been challenging, as Sarah mentioned, both for us and for many clinics. So it's important to note that whilst the HFEA didn't draft the new legislation nor set the timetable for implementation, it is our role to help clinics to understand those new rules and to ensure compliance going forward. So this has been a key focus of our work over the last 6 months. So what key dates did the legislation introduce? So as I said, it introduced the 1st of July of this year as a commencement date, the date in which the law changed and marked the beginning of the transitional period. Another important date was the 30th of June 2023. All patients storing before the law changed and where there is no effective consent to storage or consent is due to expire before the end of the transitional period must be contacted about giving or renewing their consent. Now, this is a benefit of the new legislation because clinics can now bring those gametes or embryos currently being stored unlawfully before the 1st of July over to the new rules and start storing lawfully. The 30th of June 2024 marks the end of the transitional period, and this is the date that clinics must have effective consent in place for gametes to be stored and used. Any gametes unlawfully stored must be removed from storage. And then finally, the 31st of December 2024 is another key date. This marks 6 months after the expiry of the transitional period, until which it will remain lawful to store an embryo where consent has not been renewed. However, importantly, use is not lawful during this time and further consent to storage cannot be given. So it's reassuring that there is a 2-year transitional period for gametes and embryos already in storage. But what is important to remember is that these new rules supersede all other regulations. There's now no need for a medical practitioner's statement under the 2009 rules, and there's no 10-year maximum period for storage. So what are the key headline changes for patients? As you may know, from the 1st of July, all patients can now store their eggs, sperm or embryos for their own treatment for a maximum of 55 years. But importantly, they can only do this if they renew their consent every 10 years. As I said, there's no longer a requirement for patients to satisfy the premature infertility criteria to store for longer than 10 years, as was required by the 2009 regs. So it's now more important than ever for patients to keep their contact details up to date with their clinic to benefit from the 10-year consent periods. These changes also impact patients who are already storing under the 2009 regulations. Previously, they were able to consent for up to 55 years storage without needing to reconsent, and clinics could complete an MPS in the relevant periods without patient involvement. However, under this new legislation, these patients must now reconsent when their MPS expires and every 10 years after that. We've heard concerns from clinics who are worried that they'll not be able to contact some patients who have material in long-term storage, and that these patients who would considered to be lawfully stored for up to 55 years will now need to have their gametes or embryos disposed of unless their consent is renewed. I'll shortly mention some of the work the HFEA is doing to try and raise awareness with certain patient groups about this issue. So I want to briefly outline the new rules that have been introduced in the event of a gamete provider's death. Where patients storing have given consent to posthumous use and consent to storage for a period of 10 years after their death, centres can now store these for a maximum period of 10 years after the date of death of the gamete provider. So importantly, the maximum period of 10 years is for both gametes and any resulting embryos that are created. It's not 10 years for gametes plus another 10 years for any embryos that are created. And of course, in cases where a gamete provider gives consent to posthumous use and storage for a period of less than 10 years from the gamete provider's date of death, the material can remain in storage for the period for which effective consent to posthumous storage has been given. Similarly, in cases where patients are storing their gametes or embryos for treatment, have given consent to the use of their material and consent to storage for the period in the event that they lose their mental capacity, centres can store these for a maximum period of 10 years from the date at which the person has been certified as having lost capacity. Now, if the patient is certified as regaining capacity within that 10-year period after they've been certified and wishes to renew their consent to storage, they can now do so. Centres should also be aware that in these cases, for the purpose of renewal, the consent period would be calculated differently. It would be calculated from the date the person provided their consent to storage after certification of their regained capacity. However, the maximum storage period of 55 years will still be calculated from the date that the gametes or embryos were first placed in storage. So what are the key messages for patients that we need to communicate? Well, patients must keep in contact with their fertility clinics, and this is particularly important for new patients and for patients who previously stored for their fertility, such as cancer patients. As I mentioned, they will now need to reconsent, something they did not need to do previously. And whilst life moves quickly, it's extremely important for those patients to remember to keep in contact with their clinic so they can renew their consent every 10 years. And if a clinic cannot get in touch with that patient, their eggs or sperm and embryos may be disposed of. This is even if they originally consented for more than 10 years before the 1st of July. The law also changes how long sperm, eggs or embryos of a person who has died or lost mental capacity can be stored for, as I just mentioned. So partners of someone who has died, who has their sperm, eggs or embryos stored, are also being advised to get in touch with their clinic. So to highlight these issues, we've engaged with our stakeholders and provided a suite of materials targeted at a range of professional and patient organisations. We have asked them to include content to develop stories for their newsletters, journals, websites, and social media channels in order to reach their membership or supporters. We have also approached a number of organisations to source speaking opportunities and received very welcome early approaches, including from PET, for example. So we know there are important implications for many groups, those who store because of medical treatments that can cause infertility, like chemo, radiotherapy, and hormone therapy, for example. So our comms team have been building relationships with cancer charities and coalition groups to try and get out those important key messages. And that's just a selection of some of the good responses we've had on social media. And we're working with our professional and patient-facing organisations, with our stakeholder groups sharing content, which has been much appreciated. Many organisations, in addition to those supporting donors, donor conceived and other membership bodies, have also shared updates on their websites and in their newsletters and journals. So we are trying to get those messages out. Okay, so now moving on briefly to the impact of the changes on donors and donor conceived people. So donors storing eggs, sperm or embryos can now give consent to storage for any period up to 55 years. They are not required to renew their consent in the same way that patients are required to. So clinics should offer counselling to people considering donation to ensure that they are aware of the implications of their decision, including the implications of long-term storage on all those involved. And whilst in most cases we expect donated eggs or sperm to be used within the first few years of storage, is generally what happens, we recognise the potential impact of these changes on donor conceived people and advise clinics that they should provide donors with information and offer counselling on the implications of storing their eggs or sperm for up to 55 years. Clinics should also be providing information to patients who choose donor samples about the implications to any child born as a result of their treatment of using eggs or sperm where storage has been long term. Okay, so what do the changes mean for training and for research? Under the new rules, gametes can be stored for use in training or research for up to 55 years from the date that they are first placed in storage. This maximum period applies whether the gametes were first placed in storage before or after the 1st of July 2022. The rules are different for embryos, and in relation to embryos, the maximum storage period is 10 years from the date on which consent to storage for that purpose was given. So it should be noted that the 10-year period begins on the date of consent to storage for that purpose, and that's very important, not the date the embryos were first placed in storage. Patients can give consent to storage for use of embryos in training or research for up to 10 years, or of course for a lesser period if they so wish. So I wanted to talk briefly about the impact on clinics, because we know these changes have been significant, and so there's been a considerable impact on clinics implementing them. As I briefly mentioned, the new rules are complex. They set out different storage periods depending on who is storing, the purpose of storage, or whether gametes or embryos are being stored posthumously in the case of mental incapacity. It sets out a very detailed renewal of consent process that clinics must follow at prescribed times. And defining the renewal period can be complex and will depend on the regulations that the gametes or embryos were previously stored under, say either the 91, 96, 2009, 2020, they all affect how to define the renewal period. Storage that took place before the 1st of July and where consent was provided on the old forms, MT and WT, for example, remain lawful until the point of renewal. But some clinics will be contacting patients to allow them to reconsent under the new rules to benefit from the new provisions. So again, that will cause considerable work for some clinics. And of course, these significant changes, these changes are significant for clinic staff to be able to understand. And they'll need time to update all their SOPs, their patient information, and conduct training to try and understand the new legislation. And as Sarah mentioned, we've had a short time frame for implementation. Interpreting the new rules hasn't been a simple process, and we've had little time to do it. And as a result, clinics have had little time prior to the implementation date to get everything in place. So we recognise that. So how have we as the regulator supported clinics? We established a dedicated team at the HFEA with expertise from across the organisation, and we recruited external support from people who worked at clinics and external legal advice to deliver the new guidance and forms to clinics in a very short time frame. As we developed the material, we sought advice from sector professionals such as BFS and ARCS. And at the same time, we deprioritised other work, recognising the urgency and time-dependent nature of this work. We've issued a range of guidance documents. So we issued new guidance in the form of a clinic guide to assist clinics with the understanding and implementation of the changes. Many of you will know we published new and amended consent forms for use from the 1st of July. New statutory notices and transitional period versions where necessary. We've updated licence conditions and published new and updated general directions. We've held drop-in sessions with the Director of Compliance throughout July and August and continuing to do so. And we've also recognised that people need information in different ways, and given the complexities of the new laws, we've tried to present information in different ways to the sector. So as well as the drop-in centres and the kind of written information, we've been working hard to develop flowcharts and training videos that can be used to help train staff, and we'll be continuing to develop additional guidance kind of in response to feedback from clinics. We'll be developing, for example, an FAQ on the kind of common questions we've been getting from clinics. So hopefully that will be helpful. And as I say, all our material is available in one place on the clinic portal, the new storage laws pages. So I'd encourage clinics to continue to check that page for any new information. But of course, any questions that clinics have, we're encouraging them to talk to their inspector, and we aim to get back to them as soon as possible. As you imagine, we've had quite a few queries, so we're kind of getting through them. So I wanted to end the presentation on a couple of key take-home messages regarding consent that were true before the 1st of July, and I think continue to be ever more true and important now and going forward. So just to draw your attention to the importance of clinics having a good system and a good culture in place when it comes to consent. For example, in terms of having a good system in place, as you all know, consent must be in writing. It must be given by the person giving consent unless they're unable to do so. It must be recorded using a HFEA consent form. Before consent is given or renewed, patients must be given relevant information, including on posthumous use, and must be offered counselling at every point at which they are asked to renew their consent. And more broadly, it's important to have a good culture in place. It's important to train staff and keep them up to date, to emphasise why consent is important. It's not just a bureaucratic exercise. It has real consequence if consent is taken badly or the correct information is not given. Consent should be introduced early in the treatment pathway, and there should be appropriate time given to those consent discussions. And yes, we should see consent as part of the treatment, not just as paperwork, because we all know from the stories what can go wrong if consent isn't taken properly. So those are kind of just some reminders, really, that hasn't changed, but I think is even more important with the new storage laws and complexities that kind of exist.
Next up this evening, we have Joanne Leitch. Joanne is lead scientist at Fertility Scotland, and she is also the lead clinical embryologist at Glasgow Royal Infirmary's Assisted Conception Service.
I'm going to give a clinic perspective, and just to give the viewers a bit of context around this. I'm an embryologist. I'm responsible for delivering scientific services within an assisted conception service. That's based within an large NHS clinic within Scotland. We have got really good generous funding in comparison to other areas of the UK. We have an access criteria, which means that there's equitable access to treatment for patients. An access criteria and up to 3 cycles of treatment that are offered. And those cycles are full cycles with the added embryos that are frozen included, and also patients will have gametes stored in NHS facilities within Scotland to facilitate their treatment, and that is also included in their NHS provision, so there are no charges. I want to give an overview of just the brief headlines, not much detail because Joanne has gone in depth. Main changes for centres, I have focused on 3, so if anyone is from a fertility service here thinking she's not talked about this really important part, I have 10 minutes and not 10 hours, so I've picked 3 areas to focus on. I want to talk a little bit about the implementation process and some of those challenges that I experienced. And then moving on to economic considerations of this new process and implementation and how we can sustain this change within the service. So quick overview, the Health and Care Act. These changes supersede all previous storage regulations. All patients can store their gametes or embryos for their own treatment for up to 55 years, but with a new renewal at every 10 years. There's no longer a requirement for patients to satisfy premature infertility to store for more than 10 years, and donors can store for up to 55 years with no requirement to renew. This is a really positive change, and I want to make that clear because I'm going to be talking about challenges, but it is a positive change. It's giving patients that reproductive autonomy, giving them time to make decisions, and that is a real positive change. But from these headlines, I think I naively thought this process was going to be simpler than it actually was. It's been incredibly complex and complicated, and it has not been an easy experience for clinics, and certainly for me in our clinic. So with the HFE consent forms, we found that there were significant changes. The 13 consent forms that were already in use within clinics were updated to reflect the changes that Joanne described in the storage periods, the training consent, use of gametes and embryos in the event of death and mental incapacity. There were 4 new consent forms for the renewal of consent to storage, 3 new consent forms related to the withdrawal of consent to treatment, storage and legal parenthood. So huge changes with just the consent forms. That meant for clinics that it was taking longer. There was more time taken to provide patients with the information that they needed to complete the consent forms, the time for those consent forms to be completed, and that time for questions to be asked, and increased time to review, the clinic to review to make sure the consent forms were completed appropriately and in accordance with the patient's wishes. Just very as a snapshot, the HFE-WT form is a form that a woman would complete if she's having treatment with her eggs, with donor or partner sperm. That consent form is now 12 A4 pages, which is an increase of 7. There are 27 questions that individual has to answer on that consent form, and that's an increase of 19. And this is from the previous consent form. And they have to sign and date 10 times on that consent form, and that's an increase of 6 from the previous form. So you can already start to see that this is a bit more labour and resource intensive just for the consent forms. For the renewal and transitional periods, the Act talks about a defined renewal period, and this I found was quite interesting because in the previous guidance, it was down to the clinics to come up with a robust system and being able to contact patients when a renewal period was approaching, so consent was expiring. Patients had to be given sufficient time, but there wasn't much guidance on how that should be applied within clinics. So this is a bit more prescriptive. So it sets out the actions that clinics must take. It gives time periods that we have to contact patients within. There are now statutory notices that clinics have to issue patients. So rather than their own in-house, letters or forms, we've got statutory notices that we need to use. For renewal of consent, advising that samples may be removed from storage, and also to establish a first date of storage. And we also now know that gametes can remain in storage for up to 6 months after consent expiry, and embryos for up to 12 months. And that is a change because generally, under the old regulations, samples couldn't remain in storage beyond the consented storage period. So this has caused, increased chaos, but we've had to redesign or bring forward systems to make sure it's compliant with these new regulations. And there's a potential increase for storage costs because samples can now remain in storage legally for longer, and that is a cost associated with that. They also defined this transitional period, which is between the 1st of July 2022 when the regulations came into force and June 2024. And this is a period of time where we have to contact all patients with material that expires during that period to advise them of the change in regulations, request a renewal of consent if they wish their samples to remain in storage, and to advise that they would be removed from storage if we don't obtain consent. For gametes, they need to be removed by June 2024, and for embryos, there's that additional 6-month period that they can lawfully remain in storage before they need to be removed. So most bring forward systems are established. We like to give patients lots of notice, and certainly in our clinic, we had already contacted all patients 12 months in advance to advise about their consent approaching and their options, and we are now going to have to go through the process of recontacting a number of those patients. Because there are options for more patients to now keep their samples in storage, then there's going to be an increase in patients who need their consent renewed, and an increase in counselling that will be required to support patients in making that decision making. So on those three elements and three kind of changes for centres, I want to focus on implementation strategies and barriers. So implementation is really important, because if you do not implement effectively, it is a risk for centres and organisations. Poor implementation at best can lead to increased costs to implement. It can take longer to bed into the service. It can impact staff morale and their well-being. It can reduce their trust in management being able to implement changes successfully, and that can affect future projects. At worst, it can lead to risk to patients, risks to staff, and in this case, it could be breaching the Act itself. So for those three areas I tried to cover, they've all got there's similar implementation strategies. There's whole areas of implementation science that we'll talk about, how you can successfully implement. So gaining knowledge about the implementation, planning the changes that need to be required, looking at the resources and infrastructure to make sure that you've got that support there to successfully implement. Effective engagement and communication with staff, particularly those who are going to be responsible for implementing this change. Reviewing, amending, creating processes, documentation, staff training and competency, and also being able to monitor and measure the changes to make sure that it's effective. So that takes a huge amount of time and resources to do. And the big issue has been, as Joanne from the HFE has said, it's the time periods, it's this implementation. So it was debated in the House, the Health and Care Bill was debated in the House of Lords in February. The HFE communicated immediately to PRs. They released the guidance in May, the end of May, and the new regulations hit us on the 1st of July. So these were timescales that were really difficult for us to meet and feel that we were implementing successfully or to the standards that we normally would because of these timescales and time pressures. There were also some contextual barriers to successful implementation, and it was the timing. COVID-19, workforce fatigue, staff absences, and particularly in Scotland at the time of implementation, 1 in 16 people were infected with COVID. We were still in a service recovery period from COVID, trying to get caught up in backlogs, budget constraints, supply issues. We've had issues with being able to get consumables. We are still feeling the impact of Brexit, again with supply issues for consumables and materials that we need for IVF, but also for pharmaceuticals and drugs that we use. We find a gap in skilled workers, and we are unable to recruit from Europe in the same way that we had previously. And the HFE continued with their inspections, which was difficult. And some economic considerations, as you can see, there's an increase in provision of information. Consent process is taking longer. We need to review. We need to implement new systems for bringing forward, contacting patients with samples in storage. There's going to be increased time and cost to administrate the new renewal process, more time to renew more consents, more counselling is going to be required to help patients make these decisions. Storage capacity requirements, because more people can choose to keep their samples in storage, we might find that more people opt because they don't want to make difficult decisions or they want to delay making decisions. And it may be, we may see advanced maternal age because patients can keep samples in storage for longer. We might see an impact on the average age of patients coming through for treatment. That has implications because there needs to be time to provide information for patients on the risks associated with pregnancy and advanced maternal age, and that impact on healthcare services. So how do we sustain these new regulations? I think we need to look at an economic assessment of this sustained implementation. Part of usually when you're designing a complex intervention, you would look at economic assessment, each part of that, to see how much is this going to cost? Is it going to be cost effective? And that we were unable to do that because of the time constraints. So that needs to take place. And one thing that's going to be key is this effective management of stored gametes and embryos, to make sure that we are supporting patients to make the right decisions about samples and storage. And I think patient education is key right at the start of their treatment, to start talking about if they have samples remaining in storage, what those options are, and making sure that we've got good provision of information. I think we need to look at improving patient options. And when I say that, I really mean research. Not many clinics do not have that as an option for patients, or a viable option for patients. And I think improving those options for patients, really is something that the centre should be trying to do. I think we need to provide counselling to support patients for making those decisions. And we need to work with our specialist counsellors to try and look at, that patient information, and making sure that we're providing everything we can, and looking at a cost recovery model, because all of this, there are resources and costs associated, and we may need to consider how we finance this additional storage.
I'm going to move on to the next speaker this evening, who is Sharon Martin. And Sharon is the Business Development Manager at Fertility Network UK, and she's going to give us the patient perspective of these changes.
Hi everyone, as already mentioned, my name's Sharon and I work with Fertility Network. Our role is to support patients with the emotional health and wellbeing on the fertility journey, and we provide support groups, education webinars, and signposting patients with advice and support to help them on the fertility journey. We've also got nurse helplines, so please don't feel alone if you're a patient undertaking a fertility journey. You'll find us at fertilitynetworkuk.org. So, in relation to storage, Fertility Network UK overwhelmingly support the change to the new storage laws, and it has been largely welcomed by patients for a number of reasons. Patients who have stored their eggs or sperm due to health or social reasons at a young age are able now to wait until when is the right time for them to actually use those stored gametes. And prior to this change, it was one of the things we came across quite often with people, usually health conditions like cancer, where they had stored the sperm and eggs at a fairly young age, were being almost forced into considering using those gametes, and they, at that point, hadn't even met a partner which they'd hoped to meet, and therefore were then forced into thinking about using donor to support their stored gametes. And at that time, and still across most of the UK, single people do not get funded for fertility journeys or IVF. So, it caused all sorts of issues with those patients that had to have their eggs or sperm stored due to no fault of their own, due purely to health conditions. So they've really welcomed that extended storage time. As everyone knows, more and more women are now choosing to store and freeze their eggs at a younger age due to, trying to pursue careers, trying to get onto property markets, and they're trying to really ensure themselves against, increasing maternal age at the point when they feel they will actually be financially viable and secure enough to actually start a family. They've now got that choice if they want to store their eggs in their mid-20s, that they can wait till later in their 30s or older to actually start that family. Another great area is the impact it's going to have on the trans community. Many people in the trans community undergo fertility preservation, and once again, usually at a fairly young age, and they will now be able to, it'll be on their terms in terms of timescales at whatever point they choose to actually start their family. So once again, we fully support that as well. I mean, to give you some real life examples, only last week, so timely in relation to this event, I received a call from a mum, racked with guilt. She had 2 successful rounds of IVF over 20 years ago that resulted in a twin pregnancy and a singleton pregnancy, and she did have stored embryos. However, they eventually reached the end of the storage time was, and she had to make that decision to have them donated or destroyed. And she told me on the phone it was absolutely horrendous having to make that decision. She personally felt that she wanted them kept longer. She had no particular reason, she said at the time, to think that, but now she just wonders if she just had foresight to how the future was going to look for her, because how the future looks for her now is she's got a 24-year-old daughter who has been told she's unlikely to conceive due to having such low levels of eggs and follicles in her ovaries, and she's actually in the process of selling her house right now to actually support her daughter in trying to conceive using donor and at least 1 round of IVF, trying to retrieve a quality egg from her daughter's ovaries. And and we had this conversation on for an hour about how guilty she felt about the fact that so many years ago she actually destroyed healthy, in her opinion, healthy embryos. So scenarios like that might not play out any longer. If patients have got that opportunity for extended storage. By the same token, other patients are quite glad now that they can kick the can down the line, so to speak. That 10-year storage limit did cause a lot of angst for a lot of patients. They felt it was too soon, a lot of them, to decide whether they wanted to destroy or donate those embryos. Usually they still had perhaps a young family and they didn't really know what the future looked like. So, that extension will allow them, a choice. Some of them said it's such a difficult choice to make. And I think, as Joanne said, I think it's something that probably needs to be discussed an awful lot more at the beginning of entering into a fertility cycle. So many patients don't think past the next stage of the fertility journey. However, so many get to that storage time limit, and we will come across the patients in the future who can't afford to keep paying for that ongoing storage, and they themselves will have not thought about it at the beginning. And I think Joanne said about donating them to science, which is a really good option. I don't think it is something that's talked about enough in clients at the point of consents. On the flip side, we have had patients who are needing donor eggs in particular, concerned that the changes may impact the number of donated eggs available in the UK. And they're concerned, they might have to seek treatment abroad when they're looking for donor egg, because we don't have donor eggs in this country. If other patients can just continually store theirs, for up to 55 years. We also had, some negative publicity just at the point around, when the whole legislation was getting announced, what the changes were. We got some online abuse and a couple of calls, but in the main, those calls were coming from the same group of people that are against, IVF as a pathway to parenthood. Their issue was this would create, mothers in their 60s and mothers in their 70s. Quite often, didn't even enter into conversations with some of these people because they really just wanted to vent about the whole process. Overall, the old storage laws were really never something that really concerned the majority of patients, and I expect the same with the new storage laws. It will be the minority of patients that this will impact on. So many patients don't get any extra eggs, embryos for storage, However, the charity will support anyone with that conversation, and we do have support groups, particularly for donors and for single people who are on a fertility journey. But right now, you know, it's fairly quiet from a patient perspective in relation to the changes in laws.
James is a solicitor and partner at Hill Dickinson's, and where he is a leader in their health team.
So we have these new rules, which you've heard a lot about, and they are implemented in practice in a number of different ways. There's the key legislative change, which is, although it's 2022 legislation, it's actually amending 1990 legislation, which in itself is a curious phenomenon to amend legislation that's already 32 years old. But that's the main way in which the law has been changed this year. There's a raft of new HFEA guidance, and there will have to be extensive revisions to the HFEA's Code of Practice, which I'm sure Joanne is working on at the moment, because almost every page of the code is changed as a consequence of the new rules. There are new consent forms, some of which we've already heard about, and these new statutory notices, which I'll look at in a moment. And if you are dealing with the implications and the implementation of the new rules, I'd encourage you to look at the HFEA's practical guide on how the changes can be implemented, because a lot of time and effort has gone into drafting very detailed advice and guidance for clinics on how the rules work. And in the time that we all have available this evening, there really isn't enough time to go into every complex scenario and potential twist and turn. So if there are questions that you have, that does address and answer many of those that I've come across in the last couple of months. There are new general directions and some new standard license conditions. So in terms of potential problems and legal issues, the first thing I'd flag is that this is complicated. There's a lot to consider, there's a lot to read, and there's a lot to take into account. And I'm a lawyer that spends my days reading regulations because I'm that kind of fun guy. And I find them really complicated. And I don't envy those that are responsible for implementing this on a day-to-day basis. I do think, though, that the HFEA have done a great job in drafting guidance which really tries to make it accessible, and that they did that in an incredibly short time frame. So we've heard quite a bit about this new principle of a far more equitable approach to the storage of embryos and gametes, and a far more appropriate emphasis on reproductive autonomy. And hats off to PET for the campaigning that they did to achieve this. And the nub of that in terms of the statutory drafting is in the new conditions, which make it clear that embryos and gametes can be stored for 55 years without needing to rely on premature infertility. I've also just put in here, as much as anything, as a talking point, because I found it interesting, that there's a new condition which makes it a condition of every storage license that gametes and embryos that have been kept in storage pursuant to a license must, once they may no longer lawfully be so kept, be removed from storage and disposed of. Now, the Act always said that it was a condition that embryos and gametes be allowed to perish when they got to the end of the statutory storage period. But I'm curious as to why the language was changed to, I think, reinforce and perhaps make it absolutely crystal clear that this is a statutory obligation to dispose of material at the end of the storage period, perhaps in reflection of the fact that there is now both a greater duration available, but also some greater flexibility in terms of how clinics keep and store material. There are a couple of new legal concepts which we've already talked about, and I'll only mention again briefly. These are enshrined in the regulation, so I sort of approached this from a slightly different perspective when I was looking at them. One is the consent period and the other is the renewal period. And for gametes, the consent period is 10 years from the relevant day, and that's either the day on which the gametes were first stored or the day on which consent was first given. And I think that's primarily to allow what are probably quite unusual but important circumstances where minors or those unable to give consent at the time of storage store their gametes perhaps prior to treatment. And for embryos, it's 10 years from the date of storage. The renewal period is the same for gametes and embryos, and it's 18 months, and it starts 12 months before the end of the consent period and ends 6 months after the end of the consent period. I've tried to represent that in my very simplistic, rather unprofessional boxes. They're really just, they're not mathematically correct either, but it's to indicate the idea that the renewal period stretches beyond the consent period. The second new concept that we've heard mention of already this evening, but which is a new approach to consent and storage, is this concept of the statutory notices, which gives a new function both to the HFEA and a responsibility to the clinics. And though the Act says that for both gametes and embryos, clinics must, during the consent period, ask patients to renew their consents within the renewal periods. And that request must be made before the start of the renewal period, so more than 12 months before the end of the consent period, using the appropriate HFEA statutory notices. That doesn't arise if patients have died or they lack capacity. If the patient doesn't then renew before the end of the consent period, then clinics have to send a notice, a statutory notice, stating that if they don't renew before the end of the renewal period, then their material will be removed from storage or disposed of. And their consent is taken to have been withdrawn at the end of the renewal period if the clinic has complied with those statutory requirements. So it's important that each of those steps is followed correctly and at the right time, and that the patient doesn't then renew before the end of the renewal period. So some other specific legal issues and potential problems, not necessarily problems, but things to bear in mind. And one thing I think that's perhaps worth just mentioning and emphasizing is these regulations, although they are complex and although the consequences and implications for clinics are really significant, they only relate to storage. So this doesn't change your legal obligations or responsibilities in other respects. It may adapt them, but it certainly doesn't diminish the importance of other issues. So for example, it's still open to patients to vary or withdraw their consent, and that might include the variation or the withdrawal of consent to storage. It, if anything, enhances or extends the responsibilities in relation to the requirement to provide appropriate information to patients before they provide consent and to offer counselling. And now, given these 10-year renewals, that offer has to be made again prior to each renewal. It doesn't change welfare of the child assessments or considerations. So without wishing to sound flippant, if you have a 72-year-old woman who has made the most of her 55-year period, you still need to take into account whether or not it's appropriate for her to be treated, whether for her own, in her own interests or for the interests of any child that might be born as a result of her treatment. And it certainly doesn't change the need to make sure that all forms, whether it's the new forms or other forms, are properly filled in and that they're internally consistent within themselves. And it also, as I've touched on already, reinforces some of the existing obligations, in particular the statutory duty to dispose of material at the end of the lawful storage period. There are, as Joanne touched on, there are some tricky situations where you still need to look at the old regulations and the periods that material can be stored for, where there has already been reliance on an MPS and an extended storage period is in place. And working out or calculating the renewal date in those circumstances is slightly different, because you're not looking at time from the date of storage. You have to look back at the last MPS. So the calculation there needs to be done quite carefully. And also, likewise, related to that, if you have patients who have consented to 55 years, as Joanne already mentioned, there is a risk that you may not be able to get back in touch with them, and they might have assumed that they've stored for 55 years and not know of the need for them to renew. Similarly, the fact that donors can store for 55 years without renewing, unlike patients, I think is, at least it's possible that that will increase the likelihood that they lose contact with the clinics, because that is a significant length of time. And whereas patients who maybe have embryos that are created using donor gametes, they will have to renew their consent. There's no need for the donor to renew. So there is at least a possibility that at some point children will want, or the children, donor conceived children will want to get in touch with their donors who have long since disappeared and are not in touch with the clinics at all. Two other things quickly then. I think that the lawyer in me could see some problems on the horizon in terms of the process that has to be followed in relation to people that don't renew. So that this sort of buffer has been created by allowing patients to renew given a second chance, if you like, for want of a better term. So if they don't renew during the consent period, then they're given another opportunity, and clinics can continue to store until the end of that extra renewal period. If you don't then have renewal from the patient within that final period, then at the end of that, the gametes must be removed from storage. But for embryos, the clinic has to send a further form, the NWC form, to notify the patient that consent is taken to have been withdrawn, but can continue to store for another 6 months. Now, the embryos can't be used during that time, and I'm not entirely clear what the purpose of that additional 6 months buffer is the wrong term, but why it was deemed appropriate to include that, given that the embryos can't be used. And I think I can see or envisage that process for non-renewal being quite tricky if you have patients who either don't understand it or don't understand the consequences of the non-renewal. And I think that really, to reiterate the point that's been made twice today, that really highlights the importance of the way in which patients are taken through these forms and how the forms are explained to them, and the consequences of losing touch or misunderstanding the forms need to be explained. Sarah asked me not to talk about posthumous use because of the event that's coming up in November. So I'm not going to talk about it, other than to say that there still has to be consent to posthumous use. So the new rules don't change the fact that there needs to be consent to posthumous use. So some of the complex cases that we've seen recently in relation to situations of sudden unexpected death, this doesn't change that. But if the forms haven't been completed, then the problem still arises. But other than, there is a lot that could be said about posthumous use, but you'll have to come back in November to hear about it. So I'm out of time. I will finish just by flagging a couple of things, many of which have already been flagged. I've touched on the importance of checking expiry dates. You'll be aware that there needs to be probably a series of new processes to ensure that patients are able to renew when they need to and within the timeframes that they need to, which may require updating bring forward systems. I think there'll be inevitably lots of reviews and updates to SOPs and any internal clinic consent forms that touch on storage or indeed other aspects of consent that may change as a result of the new rules. Joanne mentioned already about the importance of making sure that clinics understand why they need to keep in touch with clinics. The patients need to understand why they need to keep in touch with clinics, and that's only become more significant and noteworthy in light of the new rules. Of course, I'm going to say that you should take advice, but I'm also saying that the HFEA guidance is really good, and your inspectors will be able to help, as Joanne has already said. And then you might want to think about how you recover from going through this process. But it's doable, it's navigable, but it's not straightforward.
Counselling has been mentioned a lot, particularly as regards the implications of any decisions patients might make. Will there be any materials or specific training for clinic fertility counsellors to help them understand the wide range of issues that may arise to help them support patients while making these decisions? So I think that's a question for the HFEA. Rachel is Director of Compliance and Information at the regulator, so at the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, and she formerly was an embryologist and chair of the Association of Clinical Embryologists. So she's got experience of what it's like at the sharp end, and probably is quite pleased that she's at the HFEA perhaps, and not having to advising people how to do it and not actually having to do it herself. So welcome, Rachel.
BICA obviously do an amazing training programme, and I'm sure they will pick it up in their training programmes as well.
So for people who don't know, BICA is the British Infertility Counselling Association. So yes, that's good to hear. Sharon, have Fertility Network UK got any plans in that area to speak to counsellors or to upskill your helpline volunteers with this?
So all of our helplines are manned by staff. 2 ex-nurses actually run the helpline. All of our staff internally have been trained on what the changes are in relation to the guidelines. However, in the main, we usually will signpost patients back to the clinics to make sure that the information that they're relaying to us is accurate in relation to their stored gametes. But yeah, all our staff have undertaken training and read all the material from HFEA.
Thanks, Sharon. So I don't think anyone else needs to come in on that one, so we'll go to the next one from an anonymous attendee. This is for the HFEA. What can the period between June and December 2024 be used for if use is unlawful and consent cannot be renewed? That seems like a noodle baker to me. So who wants to take that from Joanne or Rachel?
I don't think I have an answer necessarily. It comes from the legislation that if we're talking about that extra 6 months where embryos can be stored, the anonymous attendee is right. Within that 6 months, it's not lawful to either use those embryos and the patient isn't able to reconsent to lawful storage after that point during that 6 months. So yes, there's not we didn't draft the legislation. That's in the legislation that clinics can lawfully store for that additional 6 months.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? Joanne Leitch.
Hi, I mean, this is a bit of had all of us scratching our heads at what the possible reason could be. And considering the HFE would have been one of the biggest key stakeholder in discussions, the fact that you're kind of none the wiser either makes it a bit of a strange inclusion in the law. But I'm just wondering whether there's been any patient feedback and it's perhaps actually just a period of time for someone to come to terms with them being removed. I don't know. It's just, I've no idea. I can't think of any reason why you would want to keep something in storage when it can no longer be consented or used, but perhaps no idea.
Rachel, I think, is
I would just make this very clear that, we do not draft the legislation. We are here to uphold the legislation, but we have very little involvement of what is in the legislation at all. One of the reasons that we did think that this is possible, obviously you have 2 gamete providers, and say that one withdrew the consent towards the end of the renewal process, and you had a withdrawal of consent. As you said, we have a new simplified withdrawal of consent, which is so much easier. I wish I'd have had that when I was an embryologist. It might just give you time to ask the other gamete provider to withdraw the consent so you can discard them. That's the only possible explanation that we could think of.
So the next question is from Pauline Barrett, and Pauline wants to know, where do we stand if a 55-year-old came forward requesting now to use their extended gametes? are we legally required to treat them? Allowing the extension to store gametes implies treatment. So I think, James, you touched on welfare, so I think we'll go to you first, and then perhaps to Joanne Leitch.
Yeah, well, as I said, it doesn't change the clinic's obligation to consider the best interests of the patient or the welfare of the child, considerations around the prospect of successful treatment. So it certainly doesn't, the new rules don't create any new obligation on clinics to accept patients for treatment. All it does is allow patients greater autonomy in terms of how long they choose as a maximum storage period, but it certainly doesn't create any new duty or obligation on the part of clinics to treat.
Joanne Leitch, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I completely understand and agree with what James is saying, but I think this change in legislation, what it does do is it opens up the number of people who can choose for their gametes or embryos to remain in storage, because it was almost, there was a gatekeeping. It was only patients who met the criteria for premature infertility. So I think, we don't know, but there is a chance that patients may delay even further decisions about having a family, or may have decided, I've completed, but I've got them in storage, and then reconsider at a slightly older age. I think, clinics can set their own policy. There is no legislation in the UK to say that there's an upper age limit for treatment. So there's nothing in law to say that someone can't be treated at a particular age, but it comes down to what is a safe and appropriate treatment to provide. But I think there are going to potentially be some difficult discussions in clinics with patients who are of a potentially higher or advanced maternal age, who do want to use their embryos, and those risks that could be associated with it, and discussions with obstetrics. So I don't actually know. Within our centre we would have an age limit, but each centre will set their own age limits based on patient safety and welfare of the child.
Sharon, I can see you vigorously nodding. So did you want to contribute to this one?
Yeah, I foresee this to be quite a big issue in years to come. I speak to 50-year-olds all the time. I don't just mean 50, I mean upwards of 50, who are seeking advice from us as to where they can actually get fertility treatment. So I do see the late 50 people coming back in years to come, looking to use that. And if we've got the clinic sets an age policy, then they'll be demanding a transfer to a different clinic to use those same embryos. Or they may take legal action against that clinic for setting an arbitrary age limit when they can prove to us they're super healthy and fitter than the 35-year-old person. Yeah, I think further down the line we will run into difficulties with patients in this area. People having their first baby just keeps rising in age, as it is just now, and if that continues, then who is it for us to determine that it's not good for someone age 48 if they're physically really well and they look after themselves. So yeah, I do foresee issues in this area.
Joanne, Anton.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's something that Beaker would be a good place just to provide some extra kind of counselling guidelines around this. I would say that what the 10-year renewal process does is it gives patients and clinics the opportunity to have important discussions every 10 years about whether it's actually feasible to continue storage for a further 10 years. So I think those conversations at the point of renewal are going to be really critical to really talk to patients and ensure that they understand what the implications are of kind of storing for a further 10 years and the potential limitations around age limits that clinics may have in place. So So I think, yeah, it's just really crucial, those conversations that are happening in those 10 years, and at least this 10-year renewal period does give clinics the opportunity to have that conversation with those patients at a 10-year period.
So good that you've mentioned BICO, because there's a comment on this issue actually from Angela Periclea-Smith in the questions, and I'm not expecting you to answer this, but just for extra context really, will the sector not receive a backlash from patients, particularly those who are able to store but potentially not able to use because of their own age or welfare of the child considerations, and hence have incurred costs over many, many years, and highlighting the importance of counselling at each renewal stage. And I think this is actually quite important, is that, you know, I think it was important to keep the sort of period you can store and the patient's age uncoupled, because that can lead to a whole nother load of issues for people. So it is the difficulty. Okay. The next question that I'm going to put to you, hang on a second, I'm going to scroll back up my list and there's too many questions now. So oh yes, this is quite an interesting one. Are clinics required to seek new photo ID from patients who've samples stored long term if current ID held has now expired? Is it acceptable to ask patients to upload ID to an online consent platform while renewing their storage consent? Patients will be likely to be unwilling to actually physically attend a clinic to renew their consent. So I don't know who wants to take that one first. No one's looking particularly enthusiastic. I'm going to go to Rachel because she's had the foolish and smiled at me.
Yeah, I will just say that obviously ensuring that consent is given by the appropriate person is absolutely fundamental to the consent taking process. So verifying identification is certainly an important part of that process, and we would expect clinics to do that. If there are secure mechanisms to do that on online consent platforms, because obviously somebody might have moved across the world, and if that is able to be done, there are secure platforms for consent verification. There's one called DocuSign, for example, but we would expect clinics to validate that process to make sure that they have an accurate way of obtaining that identification.
James, I know you've dealt with cases where people have perhaps have forged partners' signatures and things like that on consent forms. I wonder if you've got any comments on this one.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with what Rachel said. It's not I think the question was, are clinics required? That there isn't a sort of black and white answer to that, but as a matter of good sense and good practice, I think if there has been a long gap, then that renewal consent might be a sensible opportunity to ask them to update their ID, because goodness knows we change in our appearance. So yeah, I think it's good sense, but it's not a statutory. There is no statutory requirement to do so, but I would think it's good practice, because the consequences of getting it wrong are so extreme that it's really important to do all you can to make sure that you know who you're treating.
So sorry, Joanne Leitch, that sounds like something else to add to your to-do list. So okay. The next question is from an anonymous attendee for the HFEA. During the transition period, June 30th until 31st of December 2024, are we allowed to remove embryos from storage with no valid consent, or do we have to wait until the 31st of December? So Rachel.
Yeah, those embryos or gametes can remain in storage until the end of G24 if they're not in lawful consent at the moment. But a clinic doesn't have to do that. They can remain lawfully in storage up until that point. It would be a case of a clinic risk assessing the situation and deciding whether further correspondence is worthwhile. If you've written multiple times, exhausted absolutely every effort to trace and address, how much further can you go to try and reach those patients? So that's up to an individual risk assessment, which would need obviously to be documented very carefully in the patient record.
Okay, I'm going to go to a question now from Sharon Jones, who some of you may know because she was may recognise the name because she was very much the face of our Extend the Limit campaign. Sharon asks, what can patients be doing now to proactively ensure their consent is renewed? Do we need to wait until our clinic is prepared to handle the administration? Is there guidance from the HFEA on how to contact clinics and what to be asking for to ensure that everything is in place before June 2024? And you can imagine that there'll be quite a few women like Sharon who've been very proactive in asking for this law change, who will be anxious. So Rachel, do you want to go with that one first?
And we are trying to get the message out to patients to contact their clinics, but I'm sure Joanne can come in on this as well, that clinics do have very good bring forward systems. They have processes that they go through that are defined so that they're contacting the clinic, to contacting the patients. So it will be at each renewal phase that clinics will definitely be contacting their patients. Some clinics may contact the patients on an annual basis and ask them if they want to move over to the new provisions, of course. But I would say, clinics are very good at contacting patients, but if you have any concerns, don't hesitate to get in touch with the clinics as well. It actually helps to check up-to-date contact details for when renewal is absolutely needed.
Joanne, Leitch, did you want to come in on that?
No, I just echo everything that Rachel has just said. We do have robust mechanisms, all clinics, because the risk if it goes wrong, so the risk to patients and risk to clinics, we do have really robust systems to get in contact with patients with adequate time for them to make decisions about what they're going to do with the samples in storage.
That leads on nicely to another question, which is someone wanting to understand the practical, the nitty-gritty of this, really, and asking what staff groups are taking on the additional practical work in contacting patients in your clinic.
In terms of the consent forms in our clinic, the nurses are taking on a lot of that additional role because it was part of their job within our service, was to do consenting with patients. In terms of contacting patients, that fell under the remit of the scientific team.
The next question is from Suzanne Dark, who asks, would the HFEA support counselling being mandated rather than just the offer of counselling in order to ensure that patients are making fully informed consent, aware of implications of the signing? Many clinics have very little counselling provision. Surely this could be looked at in terms of cycles and counselling sessions provided. So I don't know whether Joanne, Anton or Rachel Cutting wants to ask about that in the first instance, and then we'll go to Sharon.
I can start off by saying that the offer of counselling is legally mandated in the legislation, whereas actually the counselling itself isn't mandated in law. Kind of this issue has arisen before in the past about whether generally counselling should be mandated, and there's been opinions expressed on both sides of how appropriate that would be. The HFEA has kind of traditionally taken the view that that actually by mandating counselling, it's not making it it's not very helpful for patients if you force counselling on them if they're not ready to accept it. And actually, how effective would that counselling be if you were to mandate it? I don't know if Rachel wants to add anything more to that, but I think we'd have very little power to actually mandate it. At the moment,
We certainly don't have power to mandate it, but we certainly do absolutely understand the importance of counselling, especially, as we've said, at the renewal process. And I think especially with the new donor regulations and the ability of donors to store for 55 years, that has huge implications for both donors, recipients, and of course the donor conceived individuals. So we do appreciate the importance of it, but we know from previous PET events that our Act is 30 years old, and at the moment it does say it is just the offer of counselling that is mandated. But of course we are looking to the future and thinking about how we can modernise the Act, and I'm sure in consultations that both the professional bodies and the HFEA look at to go forward, that's something that we can certainly include and consider.
Sharon.
I think from a patient's perspective, I don't think that would be welcome as mandated counselling. Patients are quite, wide in terms of some love the counselling, others feel we don't get anything from counselling, and others just don't want to go to counselling for whatever reason. But that's fine in the NHS where the counselling is free, whereas in the private sector, usually in some clinics it's only 1 or 2 sessions that are free, and then they have to pay for further counselling. So if it was going to come with a cost, I think every 10 years patients will be quite upset that that system or process is put in place. And I think it's always better, if something's offered without making it mandatory. I think that's a better way to work with patients.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. So if a couple have embryos frozen 2 years apart, will they have to complete separate renewal consent forms for each batch of embryos? So I'm going to go to Rachel first, I think.
If embryos are frozen, or eggs or sperm samples are frozen in a short period of time, sort of a few months, I think it's absolutely acceptable to be able to combine those onto one form. We know that pre-chemo sperm samples might have 3 or 4 or 5 samples in the space of a few weeks, and I think that's acceptable. Eggs can be batched over a few months. I think where samples are stored years apart, for management and to comply with that 10 years and the consent period, they would have to be done with separate forms.
Okay. The next question I'm going to go for is from Elaine Sutherland, who says, it's a terrible admission of ignorance. I don't think it is at all, actually, Elaine. Do patients pay for storage of gametes and embryos? I always assumed it was NHS funded. So I'm going to go to Joanne Leitch first for that one to sort of explain the differences.
Yeah, so if patients are eligible for NHS IVF treatment within Scotland, then they don't pay for the storage of their egg, sperm or embryos. But that Scotland's probably quite unique. I know that there are very different arrangements in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So there may be some patients who do have to pay for the storage of gametes or embryos in storage. So there is a very different picture across United Kingdom. There are some patients who self-fund within NHS services within Scotland, and they would pay for the storage of their gametes and embryos, but that's because they may not be eligible for NHS treatment.
Yeah, and some not called CCGs anymore, but the commissioning of funding, very often if patients achieve a live birth and they have embryos in storage, that's when funding stops, and it is very varied across England.
Yes, ICBs. That's the acronym. I don't ask what it stands for, but that's what you were looking for, Rachel. So another question for the HFEA. If MPS are no longer required, I think it'd be good in your answer to explain what an MPS is. Why can't those who have already extended use WT-MT forms, again, if you can explain what they are, to extend to the next renewal period, i.e. 10-year intervals from freezing? It's going to be more difficult for the clinics having to be tied to the historic MPS data.
So the MPS was very complicated under the 2009 regulations. Lawful storage wasn't just about the patient consent. To be able to store longer than 10 years, the MPS needed to be done before the end of the first 10-year storage period. And that was a medical practitioner's statement. And the criteria to extend under the 2009 regulations was that the patient had to be at risk of premature infertility, and it was only then that they could extend from them. And then this was quite a confusing, it wasn't well understood by the sector, that then the consent expiry date, the statutory period date, was always linked to that MPS date. It wasn't anything to do with the first date of storage. So the MPS became the really significant date for storage. And it's actually defined in the legislation in the transitional period that where the statutory period ends, that is counted as the renewal date. So we know we've got the medical practitioner's date expiry for the 2009 regulations. And then we've also got some samples stored under the 91 and 96 regulations, which expire at the 55th birthday, and then whatever is calculated on top through, there's a chair's letter from 2016, Joanne probably can remember that, just clarify that for me. But then of course we've also got the coronavirus regulations that added in 2020 that added a 12-year statutory storage period. So it is defined in the legislation, so unfortunately there's no movement from that, and it has to be that date because that's what's been said, and it relates to the end of statutory storage periods.
If every renewal was calculated the same, it would make it easier for clinics, but that's not the case. There's not anything we can do about it. It's legislation and we need to work with it, but there's nothing else I can add because you've covered it all.
Joanne, Anton, was it the 2006? Was it the 2016 chair's letter? I can't remember. The calculator for the 50.
Yeah, it sounds about right. I remember working on that. Yeah, I would just re-emphasize that the kind of the forms and we've debated a lot of how the new forms will work, and then obviously the development of the new consent forms to try and make it as easy as possible for clinics, but also to reflect what is required by the legislation. And in some areas we have more wiggle room than other areas, and some things it's stated black and white in the legislation, and therefore we developed kind of the forms and the kind of guidance to reflect that. So yes, that's one of the reasons why it is the main reasons why many of the consent forms are now longer than they were, because the legislation is now more complex, and therefore there's more questions that need to be asked and more explanation. So as I say, in some areas we have more wiggle room than others, but as Rachel said, this was set out in the transitional provisions.
Okay, the next question is from Patricia Gilbert. In the case of two females being treated together using donor sperm and also reciprocal IVF, does this couple have to reconsent every 10 years? Sounds like a law exam question. I can see lots of nods. We've not heard from James Lawford Davies for a while, so let's give him a first answer on this.
Yes. The donor doesn't have to, but the patients do.
So even though the one's donating to the other, but they will have to do that. So that's where the confusion arises, I suppose, and that why the person's asked the question. So
and also that's the same for if you're storing gametes or embryos for use in surrogacy. Even though you may have to go through the donor screening, you're storing for your own use, and therefore under the new legislation, consent needs to be renewed every 10 years.
Okay, so there are sort of lots of comments around I think the 55 years, and I think this is something that actually I think relates to what Sharon said about perhaps why Fertility Network UK received a bit of a backlash when it was first announced, that people like 55 years. How on earth did that arise? Now, someone have asked, the question that's been asked is, how did the HFEA arrive at 55 years? So I'm going to say the HFEA didn't arrive at 55 years. You can't lay that at their door. Lots of other things you might blame them for, but not that one. So they want to know why that is. So does anyone want to have an attempt at answering that? I don't know whether. I'm going to perhaps go for James for your involvement in the legislation when the 1990 Act was being updated. If you can remember anything around that time as to why 55 years was.
I can't. I don't remember why that. Rachel might. I don't remember why 55 years was chosen over other figures.
The only the conversation I recall, I wasn't at the HFEA at the time, this was a conversation that we had in a professional body situation. And we discussed that for egg storage, if a baby was born with Turner syndrome, for example, the mother could store eggs for the child at a very, very young age, but then that child wouldn't potentially want to use those eggs for 40, plus years. So that's what we felt, that it needed to be a long period potentially, and it was then the same and equitable for sperm, eggs and embryos, to allow that equity across, for whatever reason it was stored. I don't know if Joanne can remember anything else. Anton?
Yeah, no, I remember the same, that was, I think, I'm not 100% sure, but we thought that was one of the reasons. And 55, it's like with choosing any number, but it was for those people where they had conditions where a child would be born, and then the mother would want to store as soon as possible, and that 55 years gave sufficient time. And I think that's what's going to be important with those difficult conversations with patients at clinics, is that whilst they can be stored for 55 years, that doesn't mean that they should be stored, or it's appropriate for gametes or embryos to be stored for 55 years. That's the maximum, that's the ceiling. And I'm sure in the majority of cases, patients, will not need to have their gametes or embryos stored, for that period of time.
Yep, I was around for those conversations, and it was sort of a pragmatic decision, I think, that would be a number that would disadvantage the fewest people in all the different scenarios and permutations of storage of gametes that people could think of. And obviously you have to have the same limit applied to men and women. I'm going to go to a question from an anonymous attendee. If a patient or couple haven't renewed their consent and consent has lapsed, but they still have embryos in storage and they want to use those embryos, are we allowed to wipe the slate clean and reconsent them? And if so, for how long? And I think this question was both for the HFEA and for James.
Yes, so that's really the purpose of the transitional period, is to allow clinics kind of 2 years to look at what they have in storage and where things are currently being stored unlawfully. The provisions say that they don't remain unlawful, and as long as consent is obtained within the timescales prescribed by the legislation, then they can move over to the new storage regime.
I can see James nodding.
Yeah, well, it's one of the most, to my mind, one of the most curious and pleasantly surprising aspects of the new rules, because I hadn't anticipated that it would apply retrospectively. So whether you call it wiping the slate clean or giving clinics a bit of breathing space, I mean, it obviously doesn't remove the need for compliance and making sure that consents are in place as far as possible, but at least for a period there is an opportunity to rectify past mistakes and oversights and problems. Again, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but I assume that part of the thinking was that it had emerged that there were, well, certainly many, if not hundreds, of embryos that were being stored without valid consent. So there would have been a lot of court applications had the Act not been retrospective.
Okay, I'm going to ask final question now. And I think we'll go to Joanne Leitch for this one first. If a couple renews their storage period of the embryos for their own use for more than 10 years, or I think, they've gone into their second period of 10 years, let's say, but then change their mind and don't want to use them, can they donate these embryos to others?
Yes, but they would need to, they would need to receive the appropriate counselling, the screening that would go alongside donation, the counselling about the implications of donating, and they would have to complete new consent forms in order to consent for those embryos to be donated. So yes, they can.
Okay, great, because that was a short answer. I'm going to squeeze in another question. HFEA, because this is one that's I'm quite curious about this. Are there any specific requirements regarding the method of contacting patients ahead of end of their storage period, if they choose to consent to a period shorter than 10 years?
No, the legal requirement for writing out to a patient 12 months before is only around the renewal period. If your patient consents to 3 years, there's nothing in the legislation to define how you contact that patient. Obviously, you need to contact the patient to allow lawful storage before the end of that consent expiry date. But it's up to the clinic then to define how they and when they contact those patients.
James, I suppose the former lawyer in me wonders about how clinics will have to demonstrate this to satisfy, if it ever went to court, a judge that they'd actually tried their best. Have you got any parting shots on top tips what to do?
You mean in terms of getting in touch with
Yes,
patients?
In terms of communicating with patients, yes.
Oh, it's a difficult question, and there isn't a black and white answer, but I think taking all reasonable steps at last known contact details, whether it's postal, email, telephone, mobile, maybe there's permission to contact GPs, but yeah, making sure that you've really tried sending something by recorded delivery. But at the end of the day, there is only so much that can be done. I don't think it would be expected that clinics would take out adverts in papers or on the national news. So, but
I think there might be a GDPR issue with that as well.
It might, yeah.